Right. Hello and welcome. I'm Dan Costa, editor-in-chief of Techonomy and Worth magazine, and welcome to another edition of Worth Knowing, where I have the privilege to talk to some of the leaders in tech, business, and public policy that are changing how we live, work, and play today. My guest today is Kingsmill Bond. He is a senior principal at RMI and the author of a new report called Exchange Electricity. It's about our transition to clean energy sources. It's an amazing report. Kingsmill, thank you so much for joining me today.
Great. Thanks for having me, Dan.
So I think, you've written the report, I've read the report. I think the thing that surprised me most, because we hadn't talked about it before I read it, is that there's a ton of good news in your report. And that's sort of a rare thing when it comes to talking about climate change. Maybe just give people the key takeaway from the report.
So the key point about this report, which is one of a series, is that the new energy system is being built extremely quickly on exponential growth curves called S curves, and the growth is happening so rapidly that it's already caused a peak in fossil fuel demand, and by the end of this decade, these new technologies will be large enough to be driving fossil fuel demand lower, which gives us a chance of getting to the goals of the Paris Agreement, but also means a complete system change within energy.
Yeah, talk a little bit about those S curves, because I think a lot of the projections that we've seen up till now showed, slow and steady support, and growth of renewable energies. But like, what the reality of it is actually, it looks very different than many modelers forecast, correct?
I think that's a very good point. So the energy modeling community, don't forget, is very much dominated by people working for the fossil fuel industry. And turkeys don't vote for Christmas. So they've been kind of hiding this from us for years. And they've also been looking at, to be technical, they've been looking at the stocks, not the flows. But that's not how change works. You want to look at the flows of change, and you want to look at the new stuff. And when you start looking at the speed with which solar and wind and batteries are growing, it becomes extremely obvious that they're growing up, as I say, up these S curves, and this growth is extremely fast. So, for example, solar capacity installed 250 gigawatts. Last year, it's going to be 350 gigawatts. This year, 450 gigawatts. Next year, these are enormous numbers. And the fact that these enormous industries can still grow at speed and at scale, even when they're very large, is pretty much unprecedented and certainly not forecast by the incumbency.
Let's talk a little bit about solar, because it seems to me that's, I hate to say it, but one of the bright spots in our renewable portfolio. That seems like, it's amazing how quickly the costs have come down, but there are a lot of things that had to happen to make that industry work. Just talk a little bit about the development of solar and how we got to where we are today.
So solar, well, as you know, the solar industry goes right back to Einstein's discovery about the photovoltaic effect at the start of the 20th century. But what happened was that it got commercialized first by the United States, and then the baton got picked up by Japan, and then by Germany, and then by China. And as each new major country came into the game, they were able to drive costs down. So this industry has been on what they call a learning curve. That is to say, the costs of the technology been falling by around 20% for every doubling of deployment. And actually, deployment has been doubling every 2 or 3 years for decades in solar. It's only recently, however, that two things have happened. First of all, it's crossed the Rubicon, it's crossed the price point where it competes and outcompetes fossil fuels. And secondly, where it's got big enough to take all of the growth in demand for electricity. So these 2 points not coincidentally materialized at the same moment, and in the last 2 or 3 years, then people don't necessarily realize that that's happened.
That's a great story. And also, in the report, you referred a lot to China being a leader here, and making substantial investments in the space. I think that's also had a pretty substantial effect as well. Would you agree?
Yeah. So Chinese leadership is clearly extremely important to the energy transition, and to solar specifically, but the energy transition in general. And the reason why China is the leader. Well, one reason it's kind of obvious, but it's worth thinking about. China doesn't have a lot of oil and gas, and therefore they need alternatives. So that's why the government 10 or 20 years ago started putting a lot of far-sighted capital into developing these industries. Secondly, of course, it's the world leader in industries, who are the factory of the world, as you know. And then thirdly, of course, it's a big country. So when you combine all three of these things, Chinese leadership's really important. And actually, Putin's invasion of Ukraine was a kind of Sputnik moment, where the West suddenly woke up and realized that China dominated or dominates this renewable energy industry, and that's kind of sparked the IRA, and it sparked the response in Europe and across the world. So actually, strangely enough, Chinese leadership and competition has had a more powerful effect than cooperation.
So let's talk a little bit about, I think one of the things too is that there's a lot of perceived barriers to this conversion and this transition. One of the most obvious is the requirements of all the rare earth minerals, the cobalt, the nickel, the lithium that's required to do this electrification. How do you see those as a limiting factor in sort of slowing this growth?
I'd like to talk in broad terms about barriers, because one of the conundrums of the energy transition is that barriers are everywhere, but growth is still happening. So people love talking about barriers, grids and rare earth and minerals and permitting and all the problems that people face. They're all real, but nevertheless, they're consistently being overwhelmed by the fact that there are many more solutions. And that's something I guess it's quite hard for people to get their heads around, that these are genuine problems, that they're being solved all the time. And the way to think about this is to think about rights law and what's been happening, what happened in the semiconductor industry. Doubling of deployment of the number of chips in a given area every 18 months. That required Moore's law. That required a huge amount of work by a lot of people to conquer lots of barriers every single year. Every time they cross one of the barriers, then a new one materializes. It's the same thing with this energy transition. It's not easy, but we're still consistently crossing these barriers. And I think people are so focused on the problems, they're forgetting that they're being solved in other countries. There's one other sort of general point to be made about barriers before I talk about the mineral point, which is that don't forget that if I take solar and wind generation, for example, about 14% of total electricity generation, and people talk about how hard it is. Actually, there are many countries where it's 40 or 50%, but the world as a whole is only at 14. So it's completely obvious that the ceiling of opportunity for most countries is far below where we are today. So it can be done. Now coming into this question about minerals, again, this is with all due respect, this is a kind of one of the many false arguments seeded into the debate by the fossil fuel industry. We don't have enough minerals. So let's look at the numbers. Take the IEA numbers. We need we're at the moment using about 7 million tons a year of rare minerals, and that's going to go up to 30 or 40 million tons. So that sounds like a lot, right? 7 to 40, it's multiplying by 6 times. That's a lot. But compare that with the fossil fuel system, which uses 15,000 million tons of fossil fuels every year. I mean, it's a really stupid debate, actually. We obviously can do this. It's hundreds of times less stuff. And it means that we have to innovate. We have to make sure we don't chuck stuff away. We have to recycle. We have to build some more mines. We have to do that very carefully, and so on and so forth. But the point to me is that it's completely feasible.
You mentioned some countries are obviously ahead of the game. Where is this? Who are those leaders that are sort of at the forefront of this curve? And is it being driven by policy action or by business interests, or both?
Well, it used to be driven by policy when we didn't have superior economics. But as I say, in the last few years, the economic barriers have been solved, and increasingly now it's being driven by markets. That's not to say, incidentally, you don't need policy. Of course you need policy, because policymakers now need to switch from supporting the new stuff to clearing the barriers to growth. So it's a little bit like you've been pushing the boulder up a hill for for 40 years. We get to the top, the boulder starts rolling down the other side with its own momentum. You still have all these impediments which are slowing it down, and now policymakers need to switch what they're doing from supporting the growth to removing the barriers to change.
Yeah, one of the phrases in your report was very bold, and you literally declared the fossil fuel age is over. And you just mentioned that this concept of peak oil is had one connotation 20 years ago, and now has a very different one, which is that I don't know the exact year, but you said like we're going to start using the demand for fossil fuels is going to decline after, what is it, 2025, something like that.
Actually, let me make an even bolder statement for you. We would suggest that fossil fuel demand has already reached a peak in 2019. So 4 years ago, folks, wake up. That it's bouncing along a plateau at the moment. So I'm very well aware that in 2022, fossil fuel demand was marginally higher than in 2019, but that's simply a little bounce on a plateau. It will be on that plateau until the middle of this decade. And by 2030, it will for sure be in terminal decline. So, there's a very typical pattern. Actually, if you go to the United States, people don't necessarily realize this. Fossil fuel demand in the US peaked 15, 16 years ago, back in 2007, 2008. So, this pattern that I'm talking about, peak, plateau, and then decline, is actually one that we have already witnessed in many, many countries. And it's happening at a global level. And what's driving it ultimately is the speed of the growth of this new energy technology being deployed. So, again, the numbers in broad terms, incredibly simple. We use 600 exajoules of energy per annum, of which 500 is fossil fuels. The solar and wind supply is about 30. It's growing about 20%. That's 6 exajoules. Global demand is about 600, as I say, growing at 1%, also 6 exajoules. So, as you can see from that very simple maths experiment, it's not difficult to demonstrate that the growth of this new stuff is enough to take all of the supply of new energy, of global demand growth for energy. And then the point to me is that as it continues to rise up its S-curves and gets bigger and bigger, so threefold increase, for example, by 2030 is completely reasonable, normal to be expected, 3 or 4-fold actually, for solar and wind. It's just going to get big enough to start pushing the fossil fuels not out of the system. So hence the argument we make, which I don't think actually is bold at all. It's completely self-evident that we are now at the peak, or therefore the beginning of the end of the fossil fuel era.
Is there anything, you're obviously tracking this on a daily basis, was there anything in the report that you found particularly surprising?
Well, I think the thing that we found the most surprising was that the kind of arguments we're making about economic superiority and exponential growth, and inevitability of change, that those are seen to be outlying arguments, when actually they're not. They are normal, they are central, and they will, as I say, over time, to be seen as completely obvious. But I think that's what most surprises us, that the stuff that we have seen in so many other sectors, the internet and mobile phones, and then before that in cars, and indeed in electricity a century ago, you see these very, very clear patterns. It's still, people don't yet see it, and that's what surprises me.
Yeah, I wanted to ask about battery technology. That was another, it's another potential barrier that people point to and say battery technology is one of the slowest technologies to develop and improve. How do you see sort of batteries and battery technology as a technology, or is it on that same S curve, or is it going to evolve more slowly?
So again, just to look at the facts, a decade ago, in broad terms, batteries were costing you $1,000 per kilowatt hour, and now they're 150. I don't call that slow. I mean, a decade ago, we were hardly producing any EV batteries, and now we already are putting into place factories. We're already producing 500 or 600 gigawatt hours a year, and we're putting in place factories to produce 10,000 gigawatt hours a year by 2030. That is spectacular growth. So this industry, it's growing incredibly fast. It also has got this kind of learning rate where costs are falling by around 20% for every doubling of deployment. That means that 150 by the end of this decade, it's going to halve. Just again from the pure maths of how stuff is changing. So, can you imagine by 2030 we'll have solar, already the cheapest source of energy in the world, halving. We'll have battery costs halving to significantly below price parity with conventional cars, and we'll have the revolution going from its kind of core in China and then Europe and the United States into the rest of the world, into the emerging markets.
And I think before we started the call, we wanted to point out that the one note of caution in the report is that you say, although the trends are accelerating and the growth curves are amazing, that we still have work to do in order to avoid raising the global temperature by 1.5 degrees. And so maybe talk a little bit about that, about that this is all great progress, but there's probably some things we still need to do in order to actually avoid that 1.5 degree increase.
The first is that whilst disruption and radical change is absolutely on the cards, it's still not enough to get us to 1.5. It's enough to get us to the goals of the Paris Agreement, which is sub 2. But to get to 1.5, we would have to work even harder. That's one kind of general point. But that shouldn't stop us from doing what we're already doing. But it should kind of fire behind us, encouraging us to work harder. But then there's the other very general and important point, which is that I don't want your listeners to think for a second that this is easy. We have to work night and day to make all this stuff happen. So if you're a policymaker, for example, you need to be changing regulations to remove subsidies to fossil fuels. You need to make it easier to build grids. You need to make it permitting easier to deploy solar and wind fast. You need to change market structures so that you and I, as buyers of electricity, don't pay the top end price. We pay the average price and the price that the low prices that are coming in for solar. All that stuff needs to happen. We need to make sure that the technology and the capacity and the knowledge gets disseminated across the global south. There's lots and lots of work to be done. It's not easy for a second, but it's absolutely feasible. And I think this is the kind of point we wanted to make, is that we have a path out of the mess that we're in. We're kind of on that path, and we need to follow the path. It's not going to be a simple to sit back and enjoy it, but there is an answer, and we just need to get on with it.
Yeah, I know, and I'm going to open it up for questions. If anybody has questions, that we will check the chat and read those out. But I think it's a really great point. My takeaway from the report was, I knew that these technologies were advancing quickly, but to actually watch the projections and see what's happened over the last 10 years is really kind of astonishing. And I knew, solar is already below fossil fuel costs. It looks like wind is going to get there too. So it's I think that part of the reason we're seeing this acceleration is because the market forces are aligned. Like these are good businesses to start, and they're going to be very profitable for the investors that put money into them. And I think that maybe wasn't the case 20 years ago.
Absolutely true. I mean, these are now. To give you, if your listeners go and have a look at the Lazard data that comes out for US every 6 months, and it kind of just shows that if you're trying to generate electricity with coal or gas, it's now costing you $80-90, and if you're trying to do it with solar and wind, it's 30-40. It's really that far apart. And what that means is that the kind of conventional counter arguments about intermittency and grid connections and so on and so forth, they're all completely soluble, because then the cost of these additional costs are just not big enough to mean that these superior technologies will be unable to dominate. And I'll give you one other observation in terms of statistics. People are always saying to me, "Oh, it's not true. It's all fake. These numbers aren't real." Just go and take a look at the statistics on capacity. 80 or 90% of new capacity that's being built all over the world today is solar, wind, and clean technologies. No one's building the old stuff anymore. It's the end. It's the game. The game is over.
Yeah, we actually, Worth being a luxury lifestyle magazine as well as business, just did a story on Maserati, and they're converting all their models to electric vehicles. They will still have gas powered vehicles, but I mean, it shows that this trend is hitting every industry and every segment.
This is the point. It's like the reason for companies to embrace these new technologies and to restructure themselves is not to save the planet, it's to save themselves. because the world is changing. If you don't change with it, you're going to go bust. And it applies to companies and it applies to countries as well. It's a little bit like being in the year 1995 and saying, we don't have an internet strategy. We don't believe in the internet. It is just stupid.
Yeah. We do have a question that basically also is a little skeptical about battery costs and the rate that they're decreasing compared to solar. But specifically, and we talked about that a little bit, but specifically, they also want to know about alternative storage technologies, specifically hydrogen, in terms of transportation application.
So again, I mean, all of the learning rates of these technologies, they're all around 20%. I mean, it kind of depends which data set you take and which years, which countries. The reason, incidentally, why the battery learning rate is not higher is because the battery growth rates are incredibly high. The learning rate is not, I'm sorry, I don't want to get technical, but anyway, they're not actually that dissimilar. The really big difference, for what it's worth, is between solar and wind, where we apply the growth rates and the learning rates forward. Because solar is growing that much faster, it means that you're going to get $20, $30 solar by the end of this decade, but wind will be at 30, 35. So, there is a real difference there. When it comes to some of these other energy storage technologies, again, this is the most incredible cornucopia of opportunity that the world has ever seen, because we've got to massively increase the flexibility, because we're losing our fossil fuel flexibility. We need more flexibility. So yeah, you're going to get it from batteries, but you're going to get it from heat storage. You're going to get it from innovators, providing you with ways to link your car up to the grid. You're going to get it from gravity storage. You have some in hydrogen. Not that excited about hydrogen, but it's kind of little piece of the puzzle. But there's so many innovators and companies, and I go to conferences and meet entrepreneurs. It's just so exciting what's going on.
Yeah. Well, honestly, it's exciting hearing you talk about it. And I have a lot of conversations about climate and innovation, and they're not always this upbeat. But I think that you're exactly right. There's a tremendous opportunity here, and it's nice to see some things that are moving in the right direction.
Yeah. I mean, when it comes to opportunity, we have industries which are being built right now where you have guaranteed growth of tenfold or even 100-fold in the next 10 or 20 years, and that's and that high ground at the moment has been seized by China. I mean, and until the IRA and until Europe started to wake up, that was all of the future of the energy system was being dominated by China, and that's quite worrying for other countries, I guess, because there's the clues in the name. Energy equals power. So it is really important, if countries want to compete in the global marketplace, that they have to have a serious attempt to lead in this area too. And again, that's what the IRA is now doing. It's really, really extraordinary what's going on.
Well, we're going to talk to, I know we have somebody else from RMI coming to our climate conference in New York on September 20th. We're going to keep this conversation going there. Kingsmill, it was great talking to you. Thanks so much for taking time out of your day and getting on the phone with me.
Great. Thanks, Dan.
That's worth knowing for today. Thank you for joining us. And if you do want to register for our climate conference in New York City, it's on September 20th. We'll have a link in the comments, or you can find more at techonomy.com. Bye now.